Hey guys, King of Charmanders here. Today I bring to you a video on an all weapons tier list for the Vernal Invader. This video showcases tier list of the weapon types released since the Vernal Invader. And I will feature one tier list based off another source and one of my own. It's important to remember that regardless of how weapons are tiered analytically, the best weapon is the one you personally like using. Any weapon on this list has the potential to be an S tier for you if you play it well enough and it fits your playstyle. Yes, some weapons are better than others, but that just depends on whether or not you could play it. And of course, if you are an expert at playing your said weapon type, you will do a lot better with it than others, and it definitely will feel the best for you as you will maximize damage potential with it and have the most fun playing Monster Hunter now. Alright, now let's just jump right into it. So we're going to start out with the first tier list, which is from Japanese sources by Mugiwarajubi. So credits to Mugiwarajubi for this resource. She has this amazing YouTube channel. She just hit 1K subs that I will link below. Congratulations. She makes incredible graphics and has great knowledge about the game, so consider subscribing and following her content. No, seriously, she makes like the best graphics and she's incredibly knowledgeable about the game. Way better than me. I just my niche is I sit here, bend over, get abused by monsters, and then I put it in slow motion so that you understand why I just lost 69 first aid meds. Wait, no, that's not even possible. You can only have 10. 69 potions. And yeah. So definitely consider subscribing to her and again following her content. She's incredible and definitely subscribe to her. Also, her profile picture is Robin from One Piece. So if you're an anime fan like me, you should definitely follow her. This tier list is from Japanese sources, and it's based off of damage potential per weapon type. So I'm going to go through each tier as usual, and we're just going to go through each one and analyze why your weapon or the other weapons aren't as good as the others as far as damage goes. Alright, first off, we're going to start out with the bottom tier, which is the C tier, and it has the light bowgun. While the light bowgun is one of only 2 current long-range weapons, sadly it stands below the bottom of the list, and it makes a lot of sense. Because in order for you to max out damage capabilities with a light bowgun, you are needing 2 skills with multiple armor pieces, and this really kills the damage potential of the light bowgun. You need recoil down 3 and reload speed 3, and having to put armor pieces just to maximize that takes away from the fact that you can add damage additors to those slots instead. However, that should be fixed once decorations come out, because this will allow you in the future to add more damage options for the light bowgun, offsetting the fact that you need to put in armor slots for other equipment skills just for it to function as a high DPS weapon. Next, we move on to the B tier, and the first weapon type we have of the B tier is the first weapon used in the game, and that's the sword and shield. The sword and shield is the most basic weapon in the game to play with, a lot of variety and playstyle potential. Sadly, its damage output isn't the best as there are better options out there. It barely ranks above the bow in my opinion, just because with the sword and shield you just don't have anything that hits super hard. It has a lot of potential again and a lot of variety, so it can fit for the player that has loved the sword and shield, is a sword and shield main in the main series games, but you're actually much more limited in Monster Hunter now versus the main series games when you use the sword and shield. So I definitely agree, it does belong in the B tier as far as damage output goes. Second on the B tier list is the Greatsword. The Greatsword hits hard but requires a lot of patience and technique for charged attacks and the shoulder tackle. It's a very complicated weapon if you don't know what monster attack patterns are, because if you try to shoulder tackle the wrong time, it's going to suck. And although you see the big numbers, the Greatsword gets punished damage-wise greatly if you happen to miss an attack. A lot of the Greatsword's damage goes off its charge attacks. If you aren't able to hit them accurately, or if you even miss one, you're going to miss off on possibly thousands of points of damage. So it's understandable why it's in the B tier. Along with that though, the shoulder tacker is a nice addition for you to consistently deal damage, but it's feeling wise, it's probably the slowest weapon on this list as far as damage wise, and it can feel really slow and cumbersome, especially if you don't have a lot of patience when it comes to hitting a monster. And last but not least in the B tier, we have the Lance. The Lance is able to stay in a monster's face and poke it to death. The great thing about Monster Hunter the Lance in the Monster Hunter series is that you have this 360-degree field of vision, and the Lance allows you to maneuver and do all these sorts of cool things. No, seriously, when you are charging after a monster, when it runs away from you, it is so satisfying to just use the Lance and speed after that thing. Fortunately, you don't have that ability in Monster Hunter now. But using your guard skills, you can block attacks and stay in the fight. And sadly, this thing really needs a buff. All those Lance mains out there, I really do feel y'all when you're like, dude, the Lance needs a buff. Please buff this thing. Because honestly, if it wasn't for offensive guard, this weapon might have hit C tier. Offensive guard procs really well with the Lance, and literally that equipment skill, I believe, is why that it's able to keep up damage-wise and stay in the B tier. If it wasn't for the skill, you might as well just drop it to the bottom, because the Lance, that's just the way it works in Monster Hunter now, because offense takes priority over defense. And now, the second to best, the tier below the GOATs, we have the A tier. And the first off, we have the Long Sword. The first of the A tier is the Incredible Long Sword. The anime weapon of Monster Hunter now is not only a really fun weapon to use, but one of the highest damaging weapons in the game. EI Spirit / Prairie allows you to counter any monster attack and constantly apply pressure to monsters. In fact, the EI Spirit / Prairie can actually work against monster roars, so this makes it absolutely incredible and allows you to do consistent damage no matter what a large monster or any other monster tries to do to you. Unfortunately, it just goes below the S tier weapons because EI Spirit / does kind of make you fall off damage, and it can put you out of position just because it launches you a certain distance away from a monster. In most terms though, it still makes up for the fact that it has all these capabilities, and the longsword can still do a really ridiculous amount of damage in the hands of the right user. Next up on the A tier, we have the Charge Blade. The second of the A tier is the Charge Blade, released during the Vernal Invader. It is the most technical weapon of the game that is essentially a huge upgrade of the sword and shield. There's a lot of things you can do with this weapon. In addition to having its own sword and shield mode, it has an axe mode. It can guard. You have guard points. You can smash. You can charge your shield. There's so many things you can do. And the thing is, its elemental discharge attacks allow you to do big amounts of damage at appropriate windows. I definitely agree with the A tier on this thing. It's very powerful. Used in the right hand, it's super cool. You could be super aggressive. And it has even more variety than the sword and shield or the lance does as far as being able to do a lot of things as far as offense and defense. So it's really cool, really powerful, but definitely belongs in an A tier. And last but not least on the A tier, we have the hammer. So the last of the A tier is the powerful, the boinkiest weapon of Monster Hunter now, the hammer. You will boink everything to death, and it is the name of the game with the hammer. With its ability to stun, it can smack monsters into submission. So, stunning is built into this weapon, and with Slugger, you can essentially stun the crap out of monsters. And although it is slow, it can deal large amounts of damage, especially when used with other players with paralysis / stun skills. So if you have a bunch of hammer users, you can essentially just stun or paralyze a monster to oblivion, and make it so that it's safe for the rest of your team to engage whatever large monster you are fighting. Taking that into consideration, it also does large amounts of damage with its boinks. So the hammer definitely belongs up in there as far as an A tier goes. And now we have the highest tier, the weapons that rule them all from the rest of them. At first we have, for the S tier, we have the bow. And the first of the weapons is the legendary bow, as its ability to aim at weak spots and dodge allows it to output maximum amounts of damage. The charge sidestep is incredibly powerful for the bow, and at full power allows you to reposition and blast things to oblivion. Now here's the thing, even though bows help you save potions, and that they are actually really freaking good, especially if you use the Black Diablos bow, bows still require a great level of skill to maintain maximum damage range and familiarity with monster attack patterns. The last update for Fulminations of Frost actually nerfed the bow to where the distance of your most effective range is now nerfed. So in order for you to actually be really good at the bow, you need to know the appropriate ranges for spread, pierce, as well as rapid. And not only that, you need to know just how each and every other monster performs, because if a monster runs away from you and you're out of range, that lowers your DPS. And also, charge sidestepping also lowers your DPS because you have to reposition out of the way. So, the bow, while it does belong in S tier, with the gyro and everything else considered, it's still an incredibly difficult weapon to use and master. And the only other weapon to stand next to the bow in the S tier is the dual blades. The second of the two S tier weapons is the dual blades, and this is the only weapon in the game where dodging does damage at the same time so far. The thing is, burst is literally made for the dual blades, and outside of having to activate demon mode, it can constantly deal DPS to monsters. I'm pretty happy that two of the weapons that I main the most are actually in the highest tier as damage because it makes the most sense. With dual blades, like I mentioned, when you dodge, you do damage thanks to Demon Flurry Rush. Because of this, you can do a constant onslaught of damage to the enemy monster, and at the same time, you can also maintain burst quite easily with this weapon. With the ease and its just sheer aggression, just being able to absolutely deal an incredible onslaught of damage onto your enemy monster, it's no surprise that it belongs in S tier. Well, of course, the only pain of this is that demon mode and knowing when to enter demon mode as well as using demon mode effectively. This thing is literally incredibly powerful, as well as its special attack being one of the coolest animations in the game, where unlike in the main series games where you have to proc it and trigger it using a special environment and just making sure that you know what you're doing as far as finding that special environment. Actually, you just have to slide off a hill or off the wall, etc. But in Monster Hunter now, you don't have to do all that nonsense. You just have to click the special skill and you will heavenly blade dance your way from the front to the back or the back to the front and deal a ton of damage. Moving on, here's my personal tier list with mechanics. So this is my personal tier list, which takes into account a weapon and its abilities outside of just damage. I also take into consideration applicable equipment skills. So if your equipment skills make sense and they're actually really good for your weapon, I'm going to consider it in this tier, as should every other tier list should. Remember, as I said before, every weapon has the opportunity to be an S class depending on the individual player's skill with the weapon and knowledge of monster attack patterns. As the OG monster guy dude, every monster is going to be a pain in the butt no matter how much you put it. Unless it's Great Jagras or Kulu, if you're struggling with that, you definitely need to work on something else. But for the most part, again, any individual can have an S-class weapon no matter what you use, as long as you practice and again, you know monster patterns. Alright, so we're going to start off with the bottom of the list, which is the C tier, and that's Sword and Shield. There's a reason why the Sword and Shield is in the bottom of the list. It's the basic weapon that everyone starts out with. Although it is incredibly flexible as a playstyle, it lacks any unique mechanics or equipment skills that make it stand out. It's perfect as a beginner's weapon and allows players to transition to higher tier weapons that have more difficult abilities to master. Yeah, you can guard, but nothing special happens if you guard with the Sword and Shield. The fact of the matter is, unlike the main series games, the Sword and Shield just doesn't have as many capabilities as it does in the main line. So because of that, it just doesn't really do anything special. Yeah, you could do a lot of things with it, but like I mentioned before, there's nothing that really makes Sword and Shield stand out in comparison to the other weapon types. Next up in the C tier, we have the Lance. It was introduced in Fulminations of the Frost, a defensive weapon that relies on guarding and countering to take full advantage of its skills. The problem with the Lance is that offense overtakes defense in Monster Hunter now. You're not going to rely on defense. You're in fact going to destroy as much as you can from defense. But the Lance doesn't do this. Again, it's a very defensive weapon that takes advantage of things like offensive guard and guard skills, where you can perfect guard and counter and attack back and poke things to death. However, it's not necessarily the fault of the Lance that it's in the C tier, it's just the way Monster Hunter now is, and it desperately needs a buff to make it better. Next up at the B tier, we have the light bowgun. This is one of two long-range weapons in the game, and the light bowgun is able to engage monsters at long range and help you save potions. That's honestly the sole reason it's in B, but the reason why it's also in B in my book is because this weapon still needs somewhat of a buff. The perfect evade reload mechanic is great, so got a buff where if you perfect evade, you get a reload +1. However, unless you invest in recoil down and reload speed, your DPS will fall off. And the fact of the matter is, those two skills take a lot of other abilities that you can use for the light bowgun. Pushing up, we have the A tier. At first for the A tier, we have the hammer. It's one of the slowest weapons in the game. However, the hammer hits hard and has the ability to stun monsters. It also has the ability to execute charge attacks. If you get good at mastering the timing of the hammer, its attacks and its stun power, you can smash monsters to oblivion. The hammer also is able to run towards monsters, which makes it really awesome. So the hammer is a great weapon. Just because it's slow and there are a lot of openings, the thing about it is the hammer does have a lot of other capabilities and mechanics that make it stand out. There's a reason why it's an A in the damage tier, and in my book, it's an A overall in the personal tier. Because if you're really good at the hammer, or even decent at the hammer, there's a lot of things the hammer can do, especially with its stun power, that help in group play. And, of course, if you stun a monster, well, have at it. You can just Hulk smash your way to victory. As for the second weapon in this tier, for the A tier, we have the Charge Blade. This was introduced in the Vernal Invader. It was the only weapon introduced during the March Major update, and is the most technical weapon in the game that can play many playstyles and has a lot of abilities. It can be fast and has axe mode. Heck, you can even stun with it, and it has the complex guard point mechanic. The only reason it doesn't fall to S in my opinion is because of its difficulty to master and play. Of course, like I mentioned before, any personal weapon on here that you use, if you're good at it, can be an S rank. But the thing about it is, this weapon is so freaking complicated. No SNS player is going to take this and be like, wow, I know how to use this weapon most of the time. It's not that simple. And not even like semi or intermediate simple in that fact. The Charge Blade is very difficult to master and play, and not only that, there's really not a lot of skills that actually allow you to continuously keep up with a monster with the Charge Blade, unless you use guard point. But, like I mentioned, because it's difficult to learn, every monster has different guard points. So yay, there's a lot of things you need to learn and master, and it's a whole lot for any player to take in unless you have a lot of hours with the Charge Blade. At the end of the A tier, we have the Great Sword. It's the slowest weapon in the game. It's incredibly hard and has a defensive ability in the shoulder tackle that allows you to stay aggressive. Although it's slow, the charge attacks do a ton of damage and can break parts quickly. In addition, the shoulder tackle is a unique ability that shaves off a lot of damage and allows you to stay in combo. I think I read a post on Reddit that someone was using the shoulder tackle against an 8-star at only 100 and it only shaved off 20 points. That's a lot of damage from an 8-star monster with only 100 defense if you use the shoulder tackle, which is absolutely ridiculous. So, because of the shoulder tackle, there's a lot of ways you can stay in motion and you can do a ton of damage with it. But the reason why is because of just the slowness of the Great Sword is the reason why I put it in A. The shoulder tackle with it, though, is the reason why it's an A to begin with as well. You have this perfect balance of offense and defense, and as long as you are patient, the Great Sword is definitely an incredible weapon. Finally, at the top of the mountain, we have the S tier, starting off with dual blades. This was the second weapon introduced in Fulminations of the Frost, and it has Demon Mode, which allows nearly every move you make to constantly deal damage. Its special skill is also one of the coolest and hits hard. Now the thing about the dual blades, it requires quite a bit of skill to master as there are periods where you're the most vulnerable. But what makes this weapon so dang good is Burst is tailor-made for this weapon. So the equipment skill Burst, as long as you deal damage, you can consistently keep an attack boost for 4 seconds. That's the thing about the dual blades, because it attacks so much, Burst is literally made for this weapon, and that's why the dual blades is just S tier. It consistently does damage, does require skill because you need to use Demon Mode and know its attacks and its windows, and it's going to deal a ton of damage. So not only S tier in the damage book, but also S tier in my book as well. The second of the S tier weapons is the Longsword. There's a reason why this thing wasn't changed in the Fulminations of the Frost update, because in my opinion it is the coolest weapon in the game and its attacks aren't the fastest. However, a master of this weapon won't really have to worry much about potions. That's because EI Charge Slash, or the Prairie, is an incredible ability that shoots this weapon to S tier. No weapon in the game has an ability that makes you invincible against any monster attack, and it doesn't matter how strong the monster is, whether it's a subspecies, an 8, 9, or 10 star, you can still use the II Charge Slash against any attack. Because of this, the Longsword is just really freaking good. Along with that, a Master's Attack and a Master of Attack patterns will allow you again to save potions because you won't have to worry much about attacks at all. And finally, at the end of S tier, we have the Bow. It is one of 2 long-range weapons in the game and has multiple damage types that allow you to play different styles. You have Spread, Rapid, and Pierce. Now, outside of Spread, you can safely attack monsters from a distance. Charge Sidestep allows you to avoid attacks, and you must master appropriate range with this weapon and aim at weak spots for maximum efficiency and damage. The bow isn't just aim and shoot. No, there's a lot of things you have to do in order for you to make sure you're aiming and shooting at maximum power and you are able to do it safely. So the bow isn't as brain dead as people think. Just because of, again, there's a lot of things you have to consider with the bow, and with the latest, well, not the latest, but in Full Mage of the Frost, you now have to make sure your range is in line appropriately with every monster, otherwise you're not going to deal as much damage as you would. And finally, to close out, choose the weapon that best suits you. While some weapons are superior to others per data, everyone has different preferences. I always say this again, the weapon you use personally and the one you develop the most, that will be S tier for you. No other weapon will do for you. However, over time you should consider practicing other weapons just to gain more knowledge and get a different experience. I have the desire to gold every single weapon in the game, so I started to use the longsword. I absolutely love the longsword. I started boinking things to death with the hammer. I think the only weapon I haven't used or have a build for that I use to slowly build my numbers to my gold medals is actually the greatsword. So I'm probably going to do that one last. But yeah, it's always nice to have a different experience and especially gain perspectives from other players, because if you want to get really good at a weapon and know a lot about a weapon, you have to practice with a weapon. With that being said, this video is pretty long, so please do me a huge favor. Like, subscribe, and comment for the YouTube algorithm. Good luck on your grinds. Hopefully you found the weapon that works for you. If not, hopefully you're close to getting there. And I will see y'all on the next video.